Narcissus, the curse of beauty. The story of Narcissus is one of the most famous and beautiful legends of Greek mythology. It tells us about love, beauty, pride, and the tragic fate of a young boy who became a symbol of narcissism. The birth of Narcissus is shrouded in the secrets and magic of the ancient gods. His father was the river god Kefis, a powerful and majestic spirit of the river that flowed through the picturesque lands of Greece. Narcissus' mother, the nymph Liriope, was one of those graceful creatures who dwelled in the waters of rivers and lakes, guarding their purity and peace. Kefis, known for his strength and power over the water currents, often crossed paths with the nymphs living along the banks of his river. One such encounter led to the birth of Narcissus. Liriope, captivated by the beauty and power of Kefis, agreed to become his companion, and soon a boy was born who was destined to become the embodiment of perfect beauty. From an early age, Narcissus stood out among his peers with his extraordinary attractiveness, and many people, having seen him, lost their heads from admiration. The predictions of Tiresias, the famous soothsayer of ancient Greece, were often accurate and momentous. One such prediction was the prophecy given to the young Narcissus. According to some sources, Tiresias said that Narcissus would live a long and happy life if he never saw his reflection. These words cut deeply into the memory of Narcissus and his parents. They realized that their son's beauty was not only a blessing, but also a potential curse. If Narcissus ever saw his reflection and succumbed to its allure, it could lead to tragic consequences. Therefore, Narcissus' parents tried to keep him away from mirrors and bodies of water. They forbade him to go close to rivers and lakes where he could accidentally see his reflection. There were no objects in the house that could reflect his face, and even simple metal surfaces were carefully concealed. Narcissus himself also tried to avoid situations where he might encounter his reflection. He knew that his beauty was a power that could mesmerize even himself, and he was afraid to succumb to its influence. So he avoided places where he could see his face. This caution and fear of his own reflection became part of his daily life. Narcissus lived in constant fear that one day he would break the prohibition and see himself, putting his life in danger. He preferred solitude and seclusion to avoid any possible risks. However, as we know from the legend, fate proved stronger than fear and warnings. Every step Narcissus took was accompanied by a light breeze that gently touched the grass beneath his feet, making him feel as if nature itself was bowing down to him. Even the birds flying by slowed their flight to savor the sight of this marvelous creature. However, despite all this divine beauty, Narcissus' heart remained cold and impervious to the feelings of others. Girls and women literally lost their minds when they saw him. Their hearts began to beat faster, their breathing became intermittent, and their thoughts became confused in their heads. Each of them dreamed of attracting Narcissus' attention with at least one glance, hoping that he would notice her and reciprocate. But alas, all attempts were in vain. Narcissus remained indifferent to everyone who tried to win his heart. Not a single smile, not a single compliment, not even the most sincere declarations of love could awaken in him even a drop of interest. He passed by as if he did not notice anyone around him, immersed in his thoughts and contemplation of his own beauty. His cold gaze seemed to say, "You are all unworthy of my love." And indeed, no one could compare to the perfection that Narcissus saw in the mirror of his soul. Echo was one of those who were fortunate enough to meet Narcissus in his travels through the forests and valleys. This forest-dwelling nymph was always surrounded by the sounds of nature. The rustling of leaves, the babbling of streams, the singing of birds. Her voice was as melodious and gentle as the morning breeze playing with the blades of grass. When Echo first saw Narcissus, her heart sank. Never before had she met such a beautiful creature. Every movement of his body, every feature of his face, seemed to her the embodiment of perfection. She wanted to come closer, to say something warm to him, to express her feelings, but fear and timidity held her back. Finally, gathering her courage, Echo decided to speak to Narcissus. She began to tell him about her life in the forest, how she loved nature and all living things. But every word that flew from her lips was shattered by the wall of cold indifference that Narcissus had erected between himself and the world. He listened to her, but he did not hear her. His gaze slid past her as if she were invisible. And then, when Echo finished speaking, he simply grinned and continued on his way, leaving her alone, confused and broken. Echo stood where Narcissus had left her, tears rolling down her cheeks. The pain of disappointment and humiliation was unbearable. How could she have hoped that such a handsome and cold man would pay attention to her? How could she think that her feelings would mean anything to him? Her heart was bursting with grief, and she decided to seek help from the gods. In desperation, she pleaded, "O great gods of Olympus, I know that I am only a simple nymph, but please punish him for his cruelty. Let him know what it means to suffer from unrequited love." And that's when Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, intervened. She heard Echo's plea and decided to fulfill her request. Nemesis knew that the worst lesson for Narcissus would be to make him experience the very pain he had inflicted on others. She placed a curse on him. From now on, Narcissus was to love himself and suffer that love for the rest of his days. With each passing moment, his passion for his own reflection would grow until he would lose himself completely, becoming a prisoner of his own image. Thus began the tragedy of Narcissus, whose beauty proved to be his greatest curse. It was an ordinary day, no different from the previous ones. The sun softly illuminated the crowns of the trees, birds chirped merrily, and a light breeze played with the leaves, creating a feeling of peace and tranquility. Narcissus was wandering through the forest as usual, enjoying his solitude and the beauty of the surrounding nature. But suddenly something unusual caught his attention. Among the thick bushes and tall trees, he noticed a small lake that glistened in the sunlight like a mirror. The water in it was so clear and transparent that it seemed as if it did not exist at all, leaving only a perfectly flat surface reflecting the sky and clouds. Narcissus stepped closer, attracted by this unusual sight. Leaning over the water, he wanted to take a sip of the cool liquid, but suddenly stopped, amazed by what he saw. His own reflection appeared in the water. It was his first ever encounter with his own image, and it was far more impressive than he could have expected. His eyes met his own eyes, and in that instant, Nemesis' curse began to take effect. Narcissus' heart beat faster. The blood rushed to his face, and he felt a strange, unfamiliar feeling. It was more than admiration for his own beauty. It was true, all-consuming love. Narcissus could not take his eyes off his reflection. It seemed to him that he saw before him a perfect creature made especially for him. He admired every contour of his face, every feature, every shade of his eyes. It seemed that this image was more perfect than any other he had ever seen. Trying to get closer to his reflection, Narcissus reached out his hand, but the water immediately distorted his image, turning it into a blurry blur. He realized that he would never be able to touch the one he loved. Despair and frustration overwhelmed his soul, but instead of retreating, he decided to stay near the lake. Days turned to nights, and Narcissus continued to sit by the shore, never taking his eyes off his reflection. He forgot about everything else: food, drink, sleep. All that mattered was right in front of him, in that lake. Narcissus' body was gradually weakening. Days passed, and his once flawless features became less and less expressive. His skin lost its healthy luster, his eyes faded, and his hair lost its lushness. His strength was no longer enough even to get up and walk away from the lake. He remained lying on the shore, staring into the water where his reflection was still visible. Each new day brought new suffering. The love for himself, which had originally seemed so beautiful to him, had now become a heavy burden. He could no longer enjoy his reflection because he knew he could never reach it. Instead of joy and delight, he felt only emptiness and powerlessness. As the days passed, Narcissus grew weaker and weaker. His body became exhausted, deprived of food and water. He could no longer move, couldn't speak, couldn't even cry. All he had left was the ability to see his reflection in the water and feel an endless longing for it. And then came that fateful moment when his heart stopped. The last thing he saw was his reflection, which slowly dissolved into the water until it disappeared completely. Narcissus' soul left his body, leaving him lying on the shore of the lake, cold and motionless. But the story doesn't end there. On the spot where Narcissus' body lay, an unusual flower soon appeared. Its petals were snow white and its core was bright yellow. This flower was named Narcissus in honor of the unfortunate young man who could never overcome his love for himself. This flower has come to symbolize beauty, but also vanity and selfishness. It reminds people that excessive self-love can lead to tragedy. Beauty is a gift, but if it becomes an end in itself, it becomes a curse. The story of Narcissus is a profound lesson that ancient mythology teaches us. It reminds us that excessive self-love, bordering on selfishness and self-aggrandizement, can lead to disastrous consequences. Real beauty, as this legend shows, is not limited to the external appearance. Much more important are the inner qualities that make a person truly attractive: kindness, compassion, the ability to love and care for others. Pride and narcissism can be a serious obstacle to true happiness and harmony. Narcissus, being blinded by his beauty, lost the ability to see the world around him, to feel the warmth of human relationships, and to share joy with others. His tragedy is a warning to each of us. We must not shut ourselves in our own world, ignoring the needs and feelings of others. Throughout the centuries, this story has inspired many creative individuals. Writers, artists, and musicians have found in it a source of inspiration for their works. The image of Narcissus has become a symbol of narcissism and arrogance, reminding that it is important to appreciate not only the external manifestations of beauty, but also the inner essence of man. Paintings by great masters such as Caravaggio and Poussin depicting Narcissus mesmerized by his reflection convey the depth of his tragedy. In literature, too, one can find numerous references to this character. For example, Oscar Wilde, in his novel The Portrait of Dorian Gray, explores the theme of self-enchantment and its devastating consequences. Music has not been left out either. Composers such as Debussy and Ravel created works based on the motifs of this legend, conveying through sound the complexity and tragedy of Narcissus' fate. In this way, the story of Narcissus remains relevant today. It reminds us of the importance of the balance between self-love and respect for others. Only the harmony of these two aspects allows a person to find true happiness and satisfaction in life.